Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll discuss the third passage, the Humanities passage of the reading section of Form Z04. This passage is adapted from the article Photography Changes How Cultural Groups Are Represented and Perceived by Edwin Shupman by the Smithsonian Institution. The author of the passage is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. Using photographs as educational resources presents particular challenges and must be done with care. There is always more than face value in any photo, and historical photos of American Indians are no exception. Photography's rise in the late 19th century coincided with great change in American Indian communities, an era that capped over 300 years of disease, war, cultural disruption, and land dispossession. As Indian people struggle to adapt to catastrophic changes to their old ways of living, photographers took thousands of studio portraits and made what they believed to be neutral ethnographic images of the vanishing Indian. As Indian cultures bent under pressure to assimilate into mainstream America, photographers routinely captured images that compared the new civilized Indian to the tradition-bound savages. Indian delegations that traveled to Washington, D.C. to defend tribal treaty rights were photographed in studios and in front of federal buildings. Photographers also accompanied government expeditions to the West, where they documented traditional cultures, leading the way for tourists and commercial photographers who followed, carrying their cameras and preconceptions into Native American communities. These efforts generated a legacy of photographic images of American Indian people that can serve today as rich educational resources, but if used carelessly, they can also fuel romanticized and stereotypical perceptions of American Indians. Okay, so the author of the passage is an American Indian himself, somebody who comes from that culture, and he says that a photograph is not just a neutral testament to what is observed and captured at the moment it is taken, but it represents the perceptions and the biases of the person taking the photograph as well, right? And this is particularly true for ethnic minority groups like American Indians who were the original settlers, or rather the original inhabitants of America before European immigrants came and established the nation of America as we know it today. So he says, that because of that movement, because of that immigration, mass immigration from Europe, American Indians suffered many, many depredations, right? Their culture was disrupted. There were diseases that were not inherent to the American land that were brought from Europe. There were wars, there was dispossession. So all of this, kind of led into this end of the 19th century when photography emerged as an art form. And the perception or the idea was that those Indians who had kind of assimilated into the broader American culture, which was by now the European culture, was seen as civilized, while those who had stuck to their original cultures, the cultures that predated immigrants from Europe, were seen as savages. So he says, while those photographs that we have are an important educational tool, they must be studied, keeping in mind the biases and the perceptions of those who took them and where they were coming from when these photographs were taken. Consider some of the many photographs of Coyote, the Apache man who Mexicans named Geronimo. He and other Chiricahua Apaches fought a protracted war from 1863 to 1886 against the United States for the right to live in their traditional homelands rather than on reservations. The Chiricahua Apaches' fight for freedom captured the American imagination in the late 19th century. Geronimo especially became a legendary figure and a media phenomenon whose legacy has lasted into the 21st century. He became synonymous with courage, daring, and savage ruthlessness. World War II paratroopers shouted his name as they jumped from airplanes into combat. Movies, television shows, comic books, popular songs, posters, t-shirts in American cities have borne his image and name. One photo that shows Coyote and three other Chiricahuas in their camp just prior to surrendering to US forces in 1886 documents a critical and difficult day for the people who had fought so diligently for their freedom. Okay, so here we are describing the story of Geronimo, who was a native Indian, a Native American, an Apache man. And he was the leader of the group that had fought against the US for a right to stay on their traditional homelands rather than on these very specialized locations that the US government had selected for Native Americans, the reservations, right? And this paragraph talks about how he has been portrayed in American culture, in American media, as this hero, as this daring, savage, ruthless hero. But I have a feeling that the next paragraph will talk about how that legacy of his heroism does not sit well with how he was treated, during the war against the US and how he was photographed. So let's read further. In another well-known studio portrait, circa 1890, Goethe poses with a rifle. To late 19th century Americans, Geronimo was a dangerous enemy, yet at the same time a curiosity and romantic symbol of the Wild West. This photo personifies the renegade image, but strangely it was taken about 2 to 4 years after Goethe surrendered while he was a prisoner of war. Why then was this photo taken? What meaning did it convey at the time? What must have been in Goethe's mind? What does the photo mean today? Is it loaded with historical truths, or is it as empty as the prisoner's bullet chamber? So we know that Goethe, who was called Geronimo, fought a protracted war, right? So he was considered this, this symbol of daring and ruthlessness because he did not give in easily to American demands to settle on a reservation. But we also know that he did ultimately give up. He surrendered when he was a prisoner of war, and there was a photo of him taken after that, right? So the idea of taking the picture of a person who was already defeated, who was already surrendered, what does that picture indicate, especially when the legacy of that person in the popular imagination is of a hero? A few years later, Goethe was photographed again, this time in a more pastoral pose and place, holding a melon in a garden with his wife and three of their children. What was the meaning behind this photo? Did people of the time see it as a simple family photo, or did it personify the government's policy towards Indians at the time, subduing feared and hated warriors, re-educating them and teaching them to farm in order to guide them towards a better way of life? Ironically, the Apaches had long farmed as part of the traditional life they fought so tenaciously to protect. So the story of Geronimo is also the story of representation in photography, because after he was defeated and he was captured, a picture was taken, and then later another picture of him with his wife and family were taken, which was kind of a very a very simple photograph of family bliss. And the idea that was supposedly meant to be sent out was that this former soldier, this former warrior from the Native Americans had been subdued. And this is what the author wonders. Was that the idea that was being sent out? And the idea of re-education and resettlement is particularly thorny in Native American history because it implies that, they were asked to change their ways. They were asked to shift to more civilized ways. And that is ironical because the Apaches were farmers for a very long time before they were kind of made to settle on these farming communities. The educational potential of photographs is enormous. However, photographs are not objective. They can easily tell as many lies and truths. As much as any written document, they have to be read with care in order to be understood accurately in unbiased and non-stereotypical terms. Every photo of people contains history, culture, and context. To do justice to the subjects and their stories, it is crucial to fill in the information gaps. In addition to conducting background research, Try putting yourself inside these photos. Stand next to Coyote, his peers, his wife, and their children, and imagine their lives. You might begin to understand the world from their points of view. Framed with factual information and viewed empathetically, each photograph can reach its richest potential as a significant educational opportunity and resource. So the author kind of reiterates what he started his argument with, that it is important to not look at the photograph in isolation. It has to be looked at in the proper context in which it was taken. It has to be looked at in terms of who was trying to tell a story, right? So we know that in this case, the photographs were taken obviously by American photographers, some of whom represented the US government, and the idea of subduing the Native Americans, especially a heroic figure like Geronimo, was thought to be conveyed through these photographs. So a full picture, a complete picture can only be obtained when you look at the photograph in context. Question 21, which of the following rhetorical techniques does the author repeatedly use in the passage as a means to engage the reader? Forthright attacks on what he labels as readers' misunderstanding of basic historical fact, open-ended questions and appeals directed to readers, direct quotations from past readers of his work that capture their responses to his ideas, descriptions of his own experiences as a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. So it's B, right? Because we see here that, for example, right here, he appeals directly to the reader. It was where was that? Yeah, try putting yourself inside these photos, stand next to his peers, his wife, right? So he's appealing directly. And then there are a lot of questions that are raised, right? These are rhetorical questions that are meant to take the argument forward. Why was this photo taken? What meaning did it convey? So it's open-ended questions, right? He's not attacking, there's no forthright attack on what he labels the reader's misunderstanding. There are no quotations from past readers, and there is no description of his personal experiences. It can most reasonably be inferred that the author's statements about the educational use of photographs apply to photographs taken during what time period? Any time period since photographs were first taken, in the 19th century exclusively, any time period prior to the digital age but not beyond, only in 10 years after photographers first joined government expeditions to the West. So I think it's any time period, right? Yeah, as Indian people struggle to adapt, government expeditions to the West where they documented, they can serve, but if they can also fuel. So it's, yeah. So it's any photograph, any time period. Is it? No, wait, 1 second. This is a little. Photography's rise coincided with great changes. Yeah, so photographers took thousands of studio portraits. Yeah. Consider some of the many photographs. Okay, I think no, so it's not J. He's not talking about that. He's not really saying it should be the 19th century exclusively, right? Because we know that, yeah, because we know that all of these photographs, yeah, I'm just a little stuck on this question because there are such specific options here. Yeah, but I'll go with F because that just seems the obvious answer, right? He's not really making an argument for the time period in which photographs were taken and only those photographs to be analyzed and, Um, yeah. And he doesn't talk about the digital age anywhere, right? So I'll go with F. Yeah. Which of the following words is most nearly given a negative connotation in the passage? Educational, old, romanticized, and traditional. So I think it's romanticized, right? Because if you look at 28, um, yeah, because they can fuel romanticized and stereotypical perceptions, right? So the idea that, so see, the thing is, one idea is the romanticized version, which is to present the Native American as the hero of the Wild West, right? But then that again does not capture his struggle to kind of gain access to his land, the land of his forefathers, right? So that is the romanticized part, which has a negative connotation. Which of the following actions referred to in the passage most clearly characterizes a hypothetical event rather than an actual event? Um, okay, traveled to, line 17. Uh, that traveled to. So this is an actual event, so it's not F. Defend, line 18. Defend tribal, that also was actual. They defended tribal treaty rights. Farmed, line 72. They had long farmed, so that is also an actual event. Stand next to, line 83. To do justice, in addition to conducted trial, put in stand next to. Yeah, so that is obviously not an actual event. The author is telling the reader to put himself into the Native American shoes, right? So that's a hypothetical event. Particular photographs of Goethe are referred to and described by the author to support his claim that accurately understanding a photograph depends on knowing the circumstances in which a photograph was taken. Photographs can be used to date events in the life of a legendary figure like Goethe. Anyone can control his or her public image by becoming more involved in the field of photography. The merits of a photograph from the 19th century depend on who took the photograph. So it's A, right? Whenever he presents descriptions of those pictures, he also gives background information, right? About when and how those pictures were taken. For example, when he was a prisoner of war and he had surrendered, or when he was with his wife after settling on a reservation, right? So all of those. The author most strongly suggests that one reason commercial photographers began to photograph Native American communities was that commercial photographers were instructed to do so by the US government, devoted to creating educational resources about Native Americans, committed to overcoming their preconceived ideas, influenced to do so by the photographers who had joined government expeditions to the West. So obviously it's not G and H, right? I think it's F because it says here, uh, photographers also accompanied government expeditions to the West where they documented traditional cultures, uh, leading the way for tourists and commercial photographers who followed, carrying their cameras and preconceptions. Oh, so it is not F then, because the commercial photographers were not instructed to do so. They were the ones who were influenced by the photographers who had joined government expeditions, right? Okay. In the passage, the author notes that a strange aspect of the photo of Goethe with the rifle is that the photo was taken. Um, hmm, he became synonymous, fought so diligently for, yeah, it says here, yeah, he poses with a rifle, but that photograph was taken after he had surrendered, right? So that the photo was taken by an unknown photographer when Goethe was a prisoner of war with Goethe's permission by a US government photographer. So it was taken when he was a prisoner of war. So it was a romanticized depiction of his heroism. It wasn't actual because he had already surrendered. 28, the author directly refers to which of the following aspects of the photograph of Goethe in a garden as being ironic. Coyote was not a gardener, but instead was in the midst of trying to stop the US government's attack on his people. Goetle's people had long practiced farming, but the photos seem to suggest that Goetle had learned farming from others. People do not automatically think of Goethe as a man of peace. For years, it was assumed to be a photograph of someone other than Goethe. So it's G, right? Because the idea of taking a photograph of Goethe in a garden was to send a message to the larger American public that this former renegade had been co-opted into the American mainstream, and he was now, a well-settled man, and he was now farming and all of that. And that seemed to suggest that, he had been taught to farm and he had been taught to live this life on a reservation, when in fact, the Apaches had been farmers long before that, right? So, so that irony is captured in that photograph. The author indicates that for the sake of an unbiased interpretation, compared to reading written documents with care, reading photographs with care is significantly more important, slightly more important, just as important, slightly less important. I think it's just as important. It's right here, right? As much as any written document, they have to be read with care in order to be understood accurately. Right, just as any written document, right? So this was a strange question. Okay. In line 86, the word framed is used figuratively to describe framed with factual information and viewed empathetically, right? So you basically, the idea that if you know the facts, but then you also know the context, you can understand the full history of what the photograph intends to represent. The way background research can support the proper viewing of a photograph, a common means of preserving a photograph, a technique in which a photograph is displayed with factual information surrounding it, the manner in which many photographs of Goethe are displayed in museums. So it's F, right? It's the way that you can actually bring your research to a photograph and understand it in context, right? So that will help you fully understand the impact, what the photograph is trying to say. Okay, I hope 22nd is right. Yeah, it was a strange question though. Okay, so let's grade this. We have to grade from 21 to 30. 1 second. Yeah, okay. BFCJA, BFCJA, okay. JBGCF, JBGCF. Okay, so we got all correct. Right, so that was the third passage. With this, we have finished solutions for the first three passages of the reading section, as well as the solutions to the English and math sections. I'll upload solutions to the final reading passage and to the science section soon. So do come back later to check those out. I'll see you guys in a new video then. Take care. Bye-bye.